Well, today's text, as you heard Jeremiah read and as you heard his awesome children's story, I don't know what he was talking about, but no, I'm teasing. But the text is about two kinds of wisdom. It's about worldly wisdom and it's about godly wisdom. And if you've been here the past couple of weeks, you've heard Dr. Moore go through several of these illustrations. But as I thought about other biblical texts of godly wisdom and worldly wisdom, and there are many, my mind went to Noah and the ark. Noah and the ark. So I asked myself, what would you do if God asked you to build an ark? Would you do it? Would you not do it? And why or why not? That's exactly what God asked Noah to do. The time in which Noah lived sounds really similar to the day and time that we live. And if you don't believe me, take time this afternoon or one day this week to read Genesis chapter 6 and even continuing into 7. But God gave Noah a monumental task, but without explicit instructions or an explanation. And Noah never questioned God, or at least as far as we know, and he carried out the task that he was given in faithful obedience, regardless of what was going on in the world around him. Why? Why would somebody do that? Why would Noah do it? Why would we do it? Because Noah walked and he talked with God daily. They were in conversation, in communion together. They had a relationship, one of faith and one of trust and one of endurance. And most of you know I attempt to run most days of the week. And endurance as a runner, it doesn't happen automatically. It takes time and it takes work and it takes pressure and resistance and all these. And finally, you'll start to gain some endurance. Some of you are runners and you know what I'm speaking about. But day after day, Noah worked on that ark. Matter of fact, for like 120 years, he worked, giving up his entire life, his reputation, to complete this enormous task that God had given him. Can you imagine what others were thinking, what they were saying when they passed by and they saw Noah building this huge ark? He's building this huge ship. I mean, this thing is ginormous. It's not even remotely close to any major body of water. What would you say? Or what would you do if you were walking by somebody out here on East Main or whichever direction that is from here? I'm terrible with direction. But if you saw them building an ark and saying, hey, repent, there's a flood coming. God told me to build this ark. What would you say and what would you think? Recently, the youth and I watched Evan Almighty. It's a modern rendition of Noah's Ark mixed with some witty humor. How many of you guys and ladies have seen that movie, Evan Almighty? Raise your hands high. Quick, get a picture. I told you I could get them to raise their hands in worship. Praise his name. It's a funny movie. It's a funny movie. But I showed it to the students, and I wanted them to see it partly for entertainment, but I wanted them to see it and look at it theologically. It's an exercise often that we will do in divinity school, and it helps us to see God in different places and everyday things. And when they give us the assignment, we can't watch a Christian movie per se like Courageous or God's Not Dead 1, 2, and 3 or however many there are. It can't be something like that. It doesn't have to be raunchy, but it can't be a Christian movie. Because we can see God working in all different aspects of our life and everything we do if we're looking. And so it helps us to give illustrations in our sermons that you all and I can understand. After all, Jesus did the exact same thing. He gave illustrations that were relevant to his time and who he was speaking to. So let me tell you a little bit about this movie. So the movie starts, and Evan and his wife and 3 kids, they're moving from New York, and they're moving to Prestige Crest, Virginia. You see, Evan used to be a news anchor, but now he's a young, budding politician. So he loads up the family, and they move. Evan is played by Steve Carell. It's not a dirty movie, I promise. But he's this newly elected congressman. And as the sun goes down on their first night in their new home, everything's still kind of in boxes and whatnot. The wife comes in and she shares what the children had prayed for that night. She asked Evan, she said, "Would you like to hear what the kids prayed for?" He said, "Sure." And so she told him, and she said, "Do you want to know what I prayed for?" And he said, "Sure, tell me what you prayed for." She said, "I prayed for our family to get closer." And Evan responds, "Well, you didn't have to pray for that. You see, I can do that. I can make that happen." Then she asked Evan what he prayed for, and Evan kind of danced around. He said, "I really don't pray a lot, and what have you." And she said, "Well, you did promise in your campaign to change the world. Seems like you'd get want all the help that you could get." And then she rolls over and goes to sleep. So later that night, Evan's laying in the bed, his wife's sound asleep, and the news is on, and it shows a little blurb of his campaign. And there he is in front of God and everybody, promising to change the world. And with the words of his wife echoing in his head, and with the scene on the TV still burned into his mind, Evan creeps out of bed and he hits his knees. And he starts to pray. "Lord, you are the creator. After all, you've created matter and all these things. And could you help me change the world?" Evan, not being a prayer and not knowing really how to close his prayer, he says, "All right, God, I'm hanging up now. Bless you." "Well, never mind. And so he goes on. Well, the next morning, his alarm clock goes off at 6:14 a.m. It goes off at 6:14, but he didn't set his clock for 6:14. He set it for 7 a.m. He gets himself ready anyway, and it's going to be his first day at his new job. And Evan opens up the door, and he's got coffee in hand, and he's going out the door, and he trips over this huge wooden crate that's from the Alpha and Omega Building Company. And so Evan looks at the crate, and he drags this monstrosity into the house, and he looks in it, and there's some archaic woodworking tools in there, and he's like, "What is this? Honey, do you know anything about this?" Obviously she didn't. And he looks at the address, and it's for 614, but his house number is 416. So he's like, I gotta go to work. I'll deal with this when I get home. Soon after he arrives at his huge new office, where his co-workers are anxiously awaiting his arrival, they're all amazed at the grandeur of this new office that they have. One of his co-workers, Rita Daniels, played by Wanda Sykes, asked, "Does anyone smell anthrax?" Meaning, in other words, something's not right about this, because young politicians do not receive an office like this, as large and as nice as this. But Rita hands Evan a letter, and he opens it up, and it's from Congressman Long, played by John Goodman, who is Evan's new boss, and he's a well-known politician. And he says, "I hope you enjoy your new office." But that's not really all he was saying, was it? He was saying, make sure you know who got you this new office. And so a few minutes later, Rita, she carries in this stack of papers, and in the movie it's like this big, and she's stumbling around with this stack of papers. "Congressman Long wants you to sign this new bill," she says. And Marty looks at the bill, and his other coworker, or their other coworker, Marty, says, "Man, this is great. It's your first day, and Congressman Long, a well-known politician, already wants you to sign a new bill. He wants you to junior co-sign a bill. If you hook your wagon to the right star, you can ride it all the way to Pennsylvania Avenue," he says. Marty didn't know what the bill was about, and he really didn't care. He just knew it was a ticket to the top. So they was riding a gravy wagon with biscuit wheels. I mean, it was good. And they were wanting to go to the top. And truthfully, I really don't think that Marty cared what the bill was about or who it would impact or what it would impact. All he knew is it was a ticket to the top. But to appease Evan, Marty asked Eugene, a young intern, to fill them in on the bill. But as the young intern starts to read the description of the bill, Marty quickly interjects and says, that's enough. I told you it was good. Just sign the bill. Well, there's a small problem. This bill is this tall, and Congressman Long wants it signed tomorrow. Well, there's a problem. Evan, before he had left, had promised his children that he would go on a hiking trip with them. And there's no way he could read this bill, no way that he could still go on this hiking trip. So as Evan gets home and he's coming in and he's trying to be cheerful, he's carrying this huge bill of paper, or this whole stack of papers, and the kids had already been taking bets that Dad wasn't going to go hiking, that something would come up and they would be second. But they had their backpacks packed and ready just in case this time was different. But it wasn't. And so they went on back to their thing, whatever they were doing. The next morning, the alarm clock goes off again at 6:14. By now, Evan's frustrated. He hears a noise outside, and it's a lumber company dropping a big bundle of lumber off in his newly sodded yard. Sorry if Jonathan or Matt's in here. I know that hurts their heart. Evan runs outside to stop the driver from the, you guessed it, Gopher Wood Company. Go for the number 4, but it's a play on words. Gopher Lumber Company. But it was too late. The wood was addressed to house number 614, and remember, Evans is 416. He just can't figure out, why am I getting packages to the 614 and my house is 416? Aggravated, he goes inside the call to deliver company, but while he's in there, there's a protest on the television. And there's a protester holding a sign that read Genesis 6:14. And the light goes off. He's like, there's something going on. So he runs around the house yelling, do we have a Bible? Do we own a Bible? Is there a Bible in our house? And he runs around, he's digging through a box, and he pulls out a Bible. Lo and behold, there is one. And he reads it. And you know what it says. He's remembering his alarm clock, which is a General Electric. But all the letters are worn off except the GEN, and it goes off at 6:14 in the morning, but it's not set for 6:14. The Alpha and Omega Lumber Company or hardware store, and then the lumber from Gopher Wood Company. He reads the text. Make yourself an ark out of gopher wood. When he sees gopher wood, he runs outside and the bundle of wood. And while he's standing there, God shows up, which is Morgan Freeman, who starts to explain things. But Evan is not convinced he's God until he starts to tell him things about himself that no one else would know. He then tells Evan he wants him to build him an ark. Evan tries to laugh off the request, still not fully convinced it was God that he was talking to. And God vanishes, and Evan gets in the car, and he's headed to work. And all of a sudden, there's God in the back seat. Evan screams, "Ah!" And God says, "Good, the beginning of wisdom is fear." Evan says, "I'm going to call the police." And Morgan Freeman points out the window and says, "There's one right there." So Evan pulls up and he rolls down the window, and the policeman turns around, and guess who it is? It's God. It's Morgan Freeman. Everywhere he turns, God is right there. And once he finally gets to his office, he receives his new government license plate. Any of you guys know what it is? GEN 614, front and rear plates. That's how they roll up there, I guess. He then goes to his first congressional meeting, and while they're reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, God shows up, but only Evan can see him, and he says, "I pledge allegiance under me." Evan proceeds to pass out and fall out in the floor. But everybody kind of chalks it off to fear, and that it's his first day in office and all the stress. But he continues to encounter God at every turn. Before you know it, his hair starts to grow and his beard starts to grow. And his efforts to shave are pointless because as soon, and that's why I don't do it, I'm just going to be honest. No, I'm kidding. But as soon as he would shave his face, the hair would grow right back. It would just be right back, just like that. And so the next thing you know, animals are starting to follow him around 2 by 2, and God tells him there's going to be a flood, and I need you to build this ark. Evan's still not 100% sure. He agrees. He agrees to build this ark. And so God instructs him to tell others, hey, there's going to be a flood. And when they ask you who told you there's going to be a flood, you tell them God told you there's going to be a flood. Next morning, Evan gets out of the shower, and there's an old ancient robe, a biblical robe, hanging on the knob beside the shower with a note. Says, I think you'll like this, signed God. So Evan's like, what am I going to do with this? But he puts the robe on. He's like, this thing's actually pretty comfortable, But he said, I can't wear this to work. He's got another big meeting to go to. So he tries to go outside, and it just doesn't work out well. And so he's like, I'll put my suit on over this robe, and we'll be all right. And he makes the statement, the teacher comes to the student, meaning that he's smarter than God. And haven't we all done that at some point in our lives? But God entertains him and lets him go. He lets us do that sometimes too. So Evan has his suit on and this big robe, and he's bulked up and what have you. But during this meeting, deers and birds and things come busting through, and this thing's televised worldwide. And when it pans around to Evan, there he is standing in a robe, and his clothes are folded up on the counter beside him, and everybody's looking, and his wife is staring in shock and awe. She's like, oh no. And he looks like me, but he has hair. And so they say, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And his wife said, please. She's standing at home with her kids, and they're gathered around the TV to see Daddy in front of the world. And she sees him standing there with long hair and a beard and a robe. She said, please don't say in front of all these people that there's going to be a flood. And don't say that God told you there's going to be. And so Evan said, there's going to be a flood. I'm against this bill that you all are trying to propose. And they said, who told you there's going to be a flood? And you know what he said. God said there's going to be a flood. And his wife couldn't take the pressure any longer. So she gathers up the kids, and she takes them back home to Virginia, I guess. And while they're there in Virginia, she's sitting at a restaurant, and she runs out of food, so she flags the waiter over, and you know what his name is, right? Almighty. Almighty. And so it's God, of course, but she doesn't know it's God. It's this God. And so God comes up, and he said, are you all right? And she says, well, my husband is this New York Noah that everybody's making fun of. And he said, well, I like the story of Noah and the ark. It's really, and he explains it. But he said, let me ask you a question. He said, if somebody prays for patience, do you think God just gives them patience, or does he give them an opportunity to be patient? Or if somebody prays to be courageous, does God give them an opportunity to be courageous, or does he just make them courageous? And then God said, if somebody prays for their family to get closer, I think he gives them an opportunity or the warm fuzzies. And it hit her. Oh, I've got to get back home. She gathers up the kids, and they get back home. And Evan's out there in his robe, and when he comes down, the sun's shining like it is through those windows. But when he comes down, his hair is even longer, and it's white as snow. And his beard's white. Not like mine. It's whiter. So his beard is really white, and his wife starts to tell him, let's don't build this. Maybe God didn't literally mean to build an ark. Maybe he just meant it would be a flood of information or something of that nature. And the story goes, but she doesn't realize how they're going to do this task, and animals show up and with tools and all these things. Sure enough, the crowd gathers around the day of the projected flood. And it's not raining. But then it starts. And as it starts to rain, Evan's up there telling everybody, get on, it's starting, it's going to flood. But the rain stopped as soon as it got started, and nobody did it. But people hung around. They wanted to see what was happening. But then all of a sudden, Evan remembers that God had told him that Congressman Long had cut corners building this dam to save money. And that it was the dam that was going to break. And that the dam was going to flood the valley where Evan's house was and all these other homes. And so Evan starts hollering at the people, hey, it's the dam, the dam's going to break, it's going to flood. But people are laughing and mocking him. Congressman Long gets on the ark and says, stop this nonsense, let's just tear this thing down, but he doesn't do it. But he's considering getting off the ark because nothing is happening. He starts to think maybe his wife was right. But as he and his family start to walk to get off the ark, the animals start to lay down in anticipation of the flood. And so Evan's youngest son says, no, Daddy, when the animals lay down, something's going to happen. They know something that we don't. Sure enough, about that time, the dam breaks. And people start to run frantically, some away and some toward the ark. The floodwaters wash the ark all the way to the steps of the Capitol. And when it rests on the steps where Congress is meeting and talking about this new bill and these things, boom, the ark crashes in and Evan steps off in all his grandeur. And the news crew's sitting there and they said, maybe Evan Almighty is not crazy after all. Maybe they'll reinstate him Monday morning to Congress. Congressman Long runs out and says, stop this, you have betrayed me, you've done all of these things. Long story short, Evan gets brought back into office. He goes on the hiking trip with his family. And as he's on this hiking trip, there's something different about Evan. His hair's short and black again. It's not white and long. He doesn't have a beard at all. He's clean shaven and he is dressed just as normal as you and I. But he sees God standing under a tree, and only he can see God. And he excuses himself and he walks over to God. And God's smiling and he says, you know how to change the world, Evan? And Evan said, how? And God, a.k.a. Morgan Freeman, takes a stick and he spells out the word ark on the ground. And he says, a random act of kindness at a time. And he laughs and they do a little dance that he does. And he walks off and he has dinner with his family. So as I thought about that, I thought, wonder if Evan's hair really grew that long and if it really turned that white and if he really wore that robe and if there really was an ark, or was it just an illustration for us to see in this movie, let me emphasize that, in this movie, that he was standing up for what was right. He took his role as a congressman seriously, and he was going to protect and look after everybody. I wonder. The movie never really says. But you heard the story, and at the end of that story, Evan and his family, no harm was brought to them, just like in Noah's account in Genesis, no harm was brought to Noah and his family. He was obedient to God, and he loved God, and he walked with God. You heard Jeremiah read today's text, James 3:13 through 4:8 from the New Revised. This is it. We're going to finish. Let me read it to you from Eugene Peterson's version of the Message. Do you want to be counted wise to build a reputation for wisdom? Here's what you do. Live well, live wisely, live humbly. It's the way you live, not the way you walk, that counts. Mean-spirited ambition isn't wisdom. Boasting that you're wise isn't wisdom. Twisting the truth to make yourself sound wise isn't wisdom. It's the furthest thing from wisdom. It's animal cunning, devilish conniving. Whenever you're trying to look better than others or to get better of others, things fall apart and everyone ends up at each other's throat. Real wisdom comes real wisdom, God's wisdom, begins with a holy life characterized by getting along with others. It's gentle and reasonable, overflowing with mercy and blessings, not hot one day and cold the next, not two-faced. You can develop a healthy, robust community that lives right with God and enjoy its results only if you do the hard work of getting along with each other, treating each other with dignity and honor. It goes on to say, where do you think wars and things come from? And it's because you want your own way and you fight for it deep inside yourselves. You lust for what you don't have, willing to kill to get it. You want what isn't yours, and you'll risk violence to get your hands on it. Remember, change starts here on the inside. And when you change on the inside, it changes your appearance on the outside. It changes how you walk. Real wisdom begins with the holy life of obedience to God. James writes, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to you. So my question is what is God calling you to do today? Perhaps God is calling you to make a public profession of faith, and perhaps you would like to join the church, or maybe you would like to simply come down and pray. Whatever it is, I hope that you will answer, regardless if it makes sense or not, and that you would walk in humble obedience with God.